What if the world mocked you for chasing a dream you buried years ago? What if your quietest moment, hands covered in paint, no words spoken, left a room full of critics in stunned silence? This is the story of Karoline Leavitt, a White House press secretary, who walked onto an art stage and in less than 10 minutes changed what the world thought about truth, failure, and finding your voice again. If this story moved you even a little, don't just scroll. Hit subscribe to follow more untold stories like this. Tell us in the comments, when was the last time you did something just for yourself? Share this with someone who needs a reminder. It's never too late to return to who you really are. Let's make this story echo far beyond one gallery. Nobody at the White House press briefings ever asked Karoline Leavitt if she could paint. At just 27, she had already earned a reputation as one of the sharpest, most composed voices behind a podium in D.C. Her answers were measured, her gaze unwavering, and her tone always calculated. Reporters either respected her or feared her, but none of them really knew her. Not truly. Karoline lived in a modest apartment in Georgetown with her husband Nicholas and their toddler son, Nico. The place was neat, serene, almost clinical, reflecting the kind of control she demanded of herself each day. But every night after the toys were picked up and Nico was asleep, Karoline would sit quietly by the window. She'd hold a mug of lukewarm chamomile tea and stare out into the Washington night like it held something she'd lost. Few knew that before she ever dreamed of politics, Karoline dreamed in color brushstrokes, not bullet points. She once painted like she breathed. That part of her had gone silent long ago. When she was 17, Karoline had been accepted into the Vermont School of Fine Arts, a place known for producing bold creatives with fire in their bellies. She wasn't the best, but she was steady, diligent, and deeply sincere in her work. She painted landscapes, mostly quiet, contemplative scenes that felt more like reflections than declarations. But then came the critique, the moment that rewired everything. It was during her second semester. She had spent 3 weeks preparing a canvas titled The Still Bay. She remembered every detail, the muted grays, the layered ocean swells, and the silhouette of a lone boat drifting toward the horizon. She submitted it with trembling hands and stood waiting in a white-walled studio for her review. Professor Eleanora Blake didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Technically clean, she said, tapping her manicured nail against the canvas. But no fire. Karoline blinked. This is decoration. It's not art. Art demands conflict emotion that spills beyond control. You've got control. Miss Leavitt, maybe too much of it. Maybe politics would suit you better than paint. The comment wasn't cruel. It was worse than that. It was clinical, final, like a doctor closing a file and moving on to the next patient. Karoline didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, left the studio, and didn't touch a paintbrush again. She transferred schools within the year and majored in political science. That was the end of it. Or so she thought. In Washington, her rise was rapid, from campaign volunteer to communications advisor, and eventually to White House press secretary. Her ability to stay composed under fire became her trademark. But with every podium, she stepped behind, something slipped further into the past. A color, a sketch, a part of herself. Nicholas had only seen her paint once back when they were newly married and living in a tiny apartment in Boston. She had painted a scene from their honeymoon, a coastline at dusk, waves catching the last of the sun and their shadows cast on the sand. She never titled it, and she never showed it to anyone else. The canvas stayed in the back of their hallway closet behind winter coats and a forgotten yoga mat. Nicholas never pushed. He knew Karoline loved control, and whatever had made her stop painting was deeper than words. So he simply loved her, as she was quiet, measured, brilliant, and a little bit untouchable. But even untouchable people have soft spots. And though Karoline had learned how to silence herself perfectly, how to pivot, deflect, and move on, there were nights she'd stare at her hands and remember how they once blended blues and grays instead of scrolling talking points on an iPad. Her world had become sharp and practical. Art belonged to the past. Emotion belonged to press strategy. And dreams. Dreams were something she spoke about only when drafting someone else's speech, until someone would come along and dare to it what happened to the fire. And in that unasked question, Karoline's carefully folded past would begin to shift. Quietly, like an old canvas pressed under glass, starting to breathe again. It came on a Tuesday, the kind of gray-skied DC Tuesday where even the coffee felt stale. Karoline Leavitt was scrolling through briefing notes at the kitchen counter. Nico babbling on the floor with a set of wooden blocks when her phone buzzed. The subject line read, "Color of Voices, Feature Invitation." She almost deleted it on instinct. Another spam pitch. An art event misdirected, but her thumb hesitated. She tapped. It was from the Color of Voices exhibition. Committee in New York City, an annual showcase for contemporary American expression. This year's theme, Hidden Voices. And they were inviting Karoline Leavitt, yes, that Karoline Leavitt to participate in a live painting segment. Live. Painting. Karoline blinked. She hadn't lifted a brush in nearly a decade. Was this some kind of mistake? She didn't have to wait long for the answer. That night, over leftover pot roast and a glass of Cabernet, Sophie came clean. With a sheepish smile and zero apologies. "I submitted your name," she said, popping a bite of asparagus into her mouth like she hadn't just lit a cultural firecracker. "You what?" Karoline leaned back in her chair. Stunned. "I filled out the entry form. You didn't even need to submit a portfolio. They just wanted someone with cultural relevance." Sophie shrugged. "And you." Karoline narrowed her eyes. "Sophie, I haven't painted publicly in 10 years. "Exactly," Sophie said, setting down her fork. "That's why it works. Hidden voice, remember. They want rawness. You're perfect." Karoline looked away, biting the inside of her cheek. She didn't say it aloud, but one word echoed through her head. Eleonora. The professor's voice still lingered as vivid now as it was back in that Vermont studio. Maybe politics would suit you better than paint. Karoline had spent the last decade proving that prophecy right. And now, here she was, being invited not for her brushstrokes, but for her name. In a sleek conference room atop a gallery in Manhattan, another conversation unfolded. Felix Moreau, artistic director of the Color of Voices exhibition, tapped a thick folder labeled Guest Features. His assistant Amanda handed him a digital tablet showing Karoline's name on the docket. "She's trending," Amanda said. "Still under 30. Recognizable. Controversial. People either love her or don't." Felix grinned. "A White House press secretary painting. That's performance art in itself. Call her the PR wild card. Make sure the media knows. We'll sell it as a surprise moment of vulnerability." Amanda hesitated. "Some are calling it exploitative." "Please," Felix scoffed. "This isn't about technique. It's about impact. We give the audience something to buzz about, she gets her 5 minutes, and everyone walks away looking daring." He leaned back in his leather chair. "Call her a visual disruptor. Sounds better than PR clown." Right behind the branding and buzzwords, Karoline was sitting at her kitchen table that same evening reading the invitation again. Karoline Leavitt. You are invited to paint live on stage during our headline exhibition segment. You will be provided with a canvas materials and 15 minutes of undivided attention. She almost laughed. 15 minutes of attention, not as a spokesperson, not to spin a policy, but as an artist. It didn't feel flattering. It felt exposed. When Nicholas came home, tie loosened and cheeks windburned from walking home in late winter air, he found her staring at the email. She didn't even look up. They want me to paint, she said flatly. Live. At some giant New York art event. Nicholas set down his keys and came closer. What kind of event? Color of Voices. Sophie submitted me. They think it'll go viral. Probably want me to embarrass myself so they can look edgy. She paused. Felix Moreau's behind it. You know that name. Nicholas nodded. That gallery guy who did the Silent Suburb installation last year. Of course. Karoline shook her head. They don't care if I can paint. I'm not a voice. I'm a gimmick. A publicity move. Nicholas didn't respond right away. He sat beside her and looked at her face, not the press-ready version, but the tired, guarded, utterly human one he'd come to know in the still hours after their son fell asleep. Finally, he spoke. If they're using your name as a joke, you can do two things, he said. You can walk away, and maybe you should. But he hesitated. Then he added quietly, you could go, and make them regret thinking you're just a headline. Karoline scoffed. Nicholas didn't flinch. You once told me that creating something with your own hands made you feel like the world stopped spinning just for a second, that it was the only time your mind went quiet. Karoline looked down at her fingers. They were slender, still made for holding a microphone, flipping briefing cards, typing statements that echoed across networks. But once long ago, they had held brushes. They had moved in rhythm with feeling instead of fact. You don't owe them anything, Nicholas said, but you might owe something to yourself. That night, Karoline didn't reply to the invitation, but she didn't delete it either. Instead, she walked into their hallway closet and pulled out a dusty storage box from behind a stack of winter coats. Inside, an old spiral-bound sketchbook, a worn wooden palette, and a folded cloth streaked with long-dried shades of blue. She ran her fingers over the cloth, the faint scent of acrylic still clinging after all these years. And for the first time in a long while, Karoline didn't feel like a spokesperson. She felt like someone whose voice was never lost, just waiting to be heard through different colors. The next morning, she opened the email again. Her hand hovered over the reply button. This time, she didn't hesitate. Karoline didn't tell anyone she accepted the invitation. Not her staff, not the press, not even Sophie, who had started the whole mess. Only Nicholas knew, and he kept her confidence like sacred ground. The reply email had gone out at 10:43 a.m. on a Wednesday. One line, one sentence, I accept. Please confirm materials and logistics. And just like that, after a decade of silence, the canvas in her life was no longer metaphorical. That night, when Nico was asleep and the house was still, Karoline walked into the closet and pulled out a heavy plastic tub labeled College, Art in faded Sharpie. The lid creaked as she opened it. Dust floated up into the overhead light. The smell hit her first aid, paper-dry acrylic, and faint turpentine. She reached in and lifted out the top layer. Old sketch pads, smudged charcoal studies, scraps of oil-stained cloth. Beneath them was a thin 16 by 20 canvas wrapped in brown paper. She peeled it open. There he was, Nicholas, age 21, captured mid-sentence, reading a paperback by the window of their first apartment. Her brushwork had been tentative back then, the edges soft, the shadows uncertain. But the emotion, the warmth leapt off the canvas. He wasn't looking at the viewer. He was simply lost in thought the way she used to be when no one was watching. Karoline sat on the floor holding that forgotten image, and for the first time in years, her eyes welled up. Not from sadness, from recognition. She hadn't lost the fire. She had just learned how to hide it. That weekend after Nico's bedtime, she began painting again. No fanfare, no ceremony, just watercolors and quiet. The first night was clumsy. Her hands cramped. Her lines were stiff, but she didn't stop. By the third night, her brush danced a little. The fourth, she blended blues and grays like breathing. She wasn't trying to create masterpieces. She was remembering how to listen not to the news or to criticism or to the roar of a press room, but to herself, to her hands, to silence. Nicholas didn't say much, but he'd pass the kitchen and smile as he saw her hunched over the table sleeves, rolled brow furrowed, paint-stained fingers, tapping rhythm into paper. He never interrupted. He knew something old was waking up. Then came New York. The day before the show, Karoline arrived at the venue, a towering glass building downtown that screamed modern art and whispered judgment. She checked in under an alias as instructed to avoid press chaos. She wore a dark coat, no makeup, and moved quietly. No spotlight. Not yet. Inside the gallery space buzzed with nerves and neon ambition. Young artists rehearsed performance pieces. Sculptors unpacked installations, and assistants in black rushed past with clipboards and iced coffees. She was escorted to the rehearsal wing, where canvas stations had been set up for dry runs. No audience, no cameras, just bare lights, and quiet murmurings of production crew testing mics. That's when she met Marco Vallan. At first glance, he didn't look like part of the staff. A flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, chance with streaks of paint, a scruffy beard that felt more beat poet than technician. He was adjusting the lighting rig above her canvas when he looked down and said, "You're Karoline." "Right," she nodded. A little guarded. "I'm Marco," he offered. "Technical crew. Don't worry, I don't bite." She managed a half smile. "I'm not worried about you." He chuckled. "You should be." He gestured toward her sketchbook, which she hadn't realized she was still clutching. "May I?" He hesitated, then handed it over. The book was filled with recent studies, mostly soft shadows, architectural lines, silent moments. Marco flipped through slowly. No comments, no sighs. When he finished, he closed it gently and handed it back. "You're not painting to impress anyone," he said. "You're painting to breathe. That's why it's real." She blinked. That was it, nothing more. But it landed with the quiet weight of truth. No critiques, no flattery, just recognition. And that meant more than all the headlines she'd ever weathered. They tested the lights, adjusted her station, and walked her through the cue sequence. Her time slot would be 15 minutes mid-program. Live canvas, no script, no introduction, just her, the brush, and the audience. Felix Moreau, of course, never showed up in person. His assistant relayed notes. He wanted introspective colors, nonverbal impact, and nothing political. Karoline nodded and ignored most of it. That night in her hotel room with the lights of Times Square glowing beyond the window, she stared at her travel palette. It was small, just 9 colors, and a single worn brush she'd brought from home. Her suitcase sat open by the door. On top of her neatly folded blouse was the cloth-wrapped college painting of Nicholas. She had brought it for courage, maybe memory, maybe both. She unwrapped it slowly and propped it against the hotel wall. Nicholas's gaze, frozen in time, met hers once again. She whispered, "Wish me luck." And then she slept deeply quietly. For the first time in years, the kind of sleep that comes not from exhaustion, but from peace. Tomorrow, she would walk into a room filled with expectations and whispers. But for now, in this moment before the storm, she had already won something back. Her breath, her brush, herself. The Color of Voices exhibition didn't just draw artists, it drew spectacle. Held inside a cavernous converted train terminal in Lower Manhattan, the place felt less like a gallery and more like a festival of self-branding. Digital billboards lit up every corner. Massive projection screens looped curated bios of featured artists. TikTok influencers in oversized glasses gave live stream tours narrating every angle like cultural commentators. There were sculptors in neon jumpsuits, painters with gold-streaked beards, installation artists arranging flamingos made of recycled plastics, and all of them knew they belonged. And then Karoline Leavitt walked in. She entered through the East Wing dressed in black slacks, a slate-gray sweater, and no makeup. Hair pinned back. No entourage, no announcement. Just her. Yet within seconds, she was spotted. Phones rose like reflexes. The familiar clicking of shutter bursts echoed across the room. "That's her right, the press secretary. Karoline Leavitt's here." "What's she doing here? She's painting live. Can you believe that?" The words floated through the air, half disbelief, half delight. Somewhere behind her, a young woman whispered to a friend, loud enough for Karoline to hear, "I bet she paints a flag and calls it freedom of speech." Karoline didn't flinch. She kept walking. The exhibition was a circus of visuals. LED sculptures blinked against mist machines. Overhead drones recorded aerial footage, and around every corner, there was someone hoping to go viral. And yet, despite the chaos, the energy was electric. This was the world of bold expression, unfiltered and unapologetic. And into this world stepped a woman, best known for staying composed. Her 15-minute segment was scheduled right after a spoken word performance that featured a dancer interpreting grief through shattered glass. The room would be full, the lights full beam, the silence full pressure. She had no microphone, no statement to read, no pre-recorded applause to soften the nerves. As she moved toward her staging area, she caught glimpses of the whispers behind her. "That's the PR bait Felix picked. She doesn't belong here. I mean, what does she even know about art?" Backstage, a production assistant handed her a simple mic for stage instructions, then pointed toward her setup, a white canvas 36 by 48 inches, resting on a clean easel. A low table beside it held her materials, just as she requested nothing more than a compact set of 9 watercolors, a small glass of water, and a single brush. No flourish, no gimmicks. Felix Moreau was nowhere in sight, but his fingerprints were all over the event. The voice in her earpiece crackled. "Ms. Leavitt, we go live in 4 minutes. Please take your place." Karoline stepped into the soft lighting. The crowd hadn't seen her yet. Not fully. But the room shifted. Buzzed. And then the announcer's voice rang out. "In this next moment, we welcome someone known for her voice, but today she speaks in color. Please welcome Karoline Leavitt." A beat of applause. Polite, not warm. Measured, not eager. Cameras turned. Phones lifted. The crowd watched, some amused, some skeptical, then waiting to see her stumble. Karoline moved to the canvas and stood still for a breath. She didn't make a speech. She didn't wave. She simply picked up the brush, dipped it into water, touched a soft gray, and began. At first it was abstract, gentle arcs in charcoal and blue. The hush in the room wasn't reverence, it was confusion. Some leaned in, some smirked. Then she added shadows, cool tones, shaping into soft slopes. A hint of structure began to take form. Layer by layer, the image revealed itself. It was a woman, barely sketched, kneeling at the shoreline of an ocean, her hands touching the waves. The sea around her calm, but her posture suggested the tail end of a storm. The strokes weren't flashy, but they were intentional, controlled, and deeply personal. Somewhere near the center row, an art student squinted and said under her breath, "She's painting herself," Karoline continued, each line more confident than the last. The waves curled inward, drawing attention to the stillness of the center figure. There were no bright colors, no patriotic symbols, no slogans, just one woman, a body recovering, a soul reclaiming space. And for the first time since she stepped onto that stage, no one in the room was whispering. Phones stayed raised, but hands stopped moving. The crowd held still. TikTokers paused their commentary. Even the production crew in the corner exchanged glances. Something about the quiet unfolding on that canvas was louder than the noise they expected. She painted until the timer blinked $0 on the side screen. Then, without a word, she set the brush down and stepped back. A stillness filled the hall, not scripted, not planned, just there. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then a single clap. Then another. And then, like a wave cresting the room, erupted not with shouts, but with steady, rising applause. It wasn't the kind given to celebrity appearances. It was the kind reserved for truth unexpectedly found. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply looked at the canvas one more time, and then walked off stage. In the wings, Marco Valen met her with a nod. No words, just that same quiet understanding. Back in the crowd, one of the critics muttered to herself. Scribbling in a notebook, she didn't just paint. She testified. And somewhere in the production booth, Felix Moreau finally looked up from his monitor and muttered what he rarely admitted out loud. That wasn't a gimmick. That was real. The story that began with a whisper of mockery had just stolen the spotlight, not with volume, but with honesty. And Karoline, without ever raising her voice, had made the whole room listen. By the time Karoline Leavitt stepped back onto the platform for her final segment, the lights in the exhibition hall had grown hotter, the silence heavier. The crowd, still buzzing from what they had just seen her paint with a brush, expected a brief thank you, maybe a walk-off gesture, or even an awkward smile to close it out. But Karoline didn't speak. She didn't bow. She simply stood before a second canvas, larger than the last white as a sunrise stretching nearly 4 feet across. There were no tools on the side table this time. No brush. No easel. Only bowls of color cerulean blue storm gray and a golden yellow so pale it looked like hope distilled. The overhead mic picked up the faint sound of her breathing as she took a single step forward. Then another. And without ceremony, Karoline dipped both her hands into the bowls. Her palms slid into the blue first, then the gray. She blended the pigments between her fingers. No palette, no structure, just instinct and memory. A few heads in the audience turned. One woman near the front row frowned. Someone whispered, "Is she doing finger painting now?" Another voice replied with a chuckle. "She's not even trying to be serious anymore. Must be a performance piece." But Karoline didn't hear them. Or maybe she chose not to. Because in that moment she wasn't performing. She was remembering. She was returning. With both hands, she touched the canvas and began. Broad strokes across the lower half, blue and gray, mingling like waves after a storm. No lines, no figures yet. Just movement. Flow. Each smear of color from her fingertips dragged a memory through the fabric of that room. Not a concept, not a message. A moment. Then came the golden yellow, her fingers trembling just slightly as she streaked it across the top edge, hinting at a distant light. Not quite sunrise. Not quite healing. Just enough warmth to suggest something was returning. The crowd quieted. Those still muttering found their words fading into their own throats. Karoline's movement slowed, became more intentional. She shaped with the side of her hand, now curving a soft silhouette in the center of the canvas. A figure. Small, kneeling at the shoreline, the water surrounding her almost swallowing her outline. It was a woman faceless, undefined, pushed low by invisible winds, but still grounded. Still there. Hair whipped sideways in faint gray strokes. One hand extended toward the sea, the other reaching behind her. Perhaps for balance, perhaps for something lost. It wasn't a political metaphor. It wasn't a commentary. It was confession. The room had grown still again. No more clicks from phones. No more snide remarks. Even the event staff behind the curtain watched the monitors, with their arms folded not in skepticism, but in awe. 8 minutes passed. No music, no narration. Just the soft, wet smears of paint, and a woman painting with her bare hands. Someone in the third row leaned forward and murmured, "He's not painting a scene. She's painting something she lived through." A few nodded. No one corrected them. As Karoline continued shaping the waves and her movement slowed. She was nearing the end, not because the timer demanded it, but because the painting itself was complete. It told the story without punctuation. The woman on the canvas was no longer fragile. She was steady. Even as the sky bent above her, even as the sea tried to reclaim her, she remained. Karoline stepped back, her hands dripping in color, her clothes untouched. The canvas glowed beneath the lights, not in brightness, but in truth. The title had never been spoken aloud, but Sophie, watching from the side, knew it immediately. Still, Sea After Storm. And the woman was Karoline. Maybe not in shape or shadow, but in essence. The silence that followed was sacred. Not stunned. Not confused. Just still. No curated applause cue. No redirection from hosts. The audience sat with it. And then from the center aisle, an older man stood. Gently. No theatrics. Just reverence. He clapped once. Then again. Slowly others followed. Not everyone understood what they had just seen. But they knew what it felt like. It felt like loss. It felt like healing. It felt like a voice long buried, finally spoken, not in sound, but in color. In the wings, Marco Vallon watched with folded arms, nodding to no one in particular. His expression didn't change, but his eyes glistened. He had said it before. You're not painting to be praised. You're painting to breathe. And breathe she had. Karoline turned toward the audience just once, long enough to nod, long enough to let them know she saw them. But she didn't smile. She didn't need to. Because the painting did that for her. It stood as proof not that she was a great artist, or that she had something to prove, but that she had something left to feel. Something worth touching, without gloves, worth staining her hands over. Worth stepping back into the fire for. And for the first time since she was 17, Karoline Leavitt walked off stage. Not as a spokesperson, not as a political figurehead, not even as a performer, but as an artist. Not because of the technique, but because she had painted, Not with her hands, but with her history. Karoline Leavitt stood in front of her finished canvas, both hands stained with color, the air around her still crackling with emotion. But she didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply stood there, just a foot back from the edge of the painting, eyes fixed on the sea of faces before her, most of them frozen in place. The image she had left on the canvas behind her, still see. After Storm had stopped the entire exhibition in its tracks. 7 seconds passed. No music, no commentary, no scripted transition. 7 full seconds of pure collective silence where nobody looked at their phones, nobody whispered to the person next to them, and nobody even dared to blink too loudly. It was as if time had stalled, waiting to see how to respond to something so deeply human. And then came the moment that would ripple far beyond the walls of that gallery. From the third row, a man stood slowly. He was tall, older, in a tweed jacket with soft lines on his face and gray in his beard. His name was Sebastian Rion, a renowned painter art historian and former dean at the Rhode Island School of Design. He wasn't known for praise. In fact, he was famous for his icy critiques and impossible standards. But now he looked straight at Karoline, his voice calm but unwavering as it echoed across the room. "I've taught art for over 30 years, he said. But today I learned something about feeling again. He didn't embellish. He didn't exaggerate. Just truth spoken quietly, but heard like thunder. A murmur ran through the room, then a breath, then applause, tentative at first, hesitant, as though people needed permission to respond. But once it started, it grew. People stood, first in clusters, then rows, then the entire hall. There weren't shouts or whoops. This wasn't the end of a rock concert. It was reverence. Hands clapping not just for what they saw, but for what they felt. Some were crying. Others clasped their chests like they'd been holding something in for too long. A woman near the back whispered through tears, "I haven't felt like this since I saw my daughter's first drawing." Social media influencers who had originally planned to mock the moment with captions like, "Politician tries painting, watch what happens," found themselves lowering their phones and watching in stunned silence. Several of them later posted the full clip, unedited, writing things like, "I don't have words for this, and maybe art can be healing." Backstage. Sophie covered her mouth with both hands. The woman she had known since college, the one who used to paint at midnight in dorm stairwells, but abandoned it after one teacher's brutal comment, was now standing on a stage full of strangers, having pulled the entire room into her soul without saying a single word. And Marco Vallen. He just stood off to the side, arms folded, nodding once like a man who already knew what everyone else was just now realizing. It was never about being perfect. It was about being true. News outlets had arrived with one narrative in mind, a political figure doing something outside her lane, maybe as a PR stunt. But what they captured instead was something honest, something they couldn't edit into a cheap headline. Within minutes, the footage went viral, not because it was sensational, but because it was sincere. Comments flooded in. "I've never seen a performance so still, yet so loud." That painting felt like a story I've never told anyone. She reminded me that it's never too late to return to who you were. And perhaps most humbling of all, an arts columnist from the New York Times, who once called the event a circus of curated chaos, published a rare one-line article. Karoline Leavitt didn't break the silence. She made it holy. That night, the buzz around her grew not as a press secretary, not as a guest, not even as a painter, but as a voice. Not loud, not theatrical, just undeniable. When Karoline finally stepped away from the canvas and exited through the side hall, she didn't carry a trophy or a press badge, just paint on her fingers and a quiet sense of peace. Backstage, Sophie threw her arms around her. "You did it," she whispered, still blinking back tears. "You really, really did it." Karoline pulled away gently and replied not with pride, but with something deeper. "I didn't come here to prove anything. I came because I couldn't stay silent anymore." Then she looked down at her hands smudged with blue, gray, and yellow. Not dirty, not unprofessional, just alive. As the crowd continued to applaud inside, she and Marco walked together down the corridor toward the rear exit. No fanfare, no lights. Just two people who understood that sometimes art wasn't about applause or galleries or reviews. Sometimes art was the moment you let the storm pass and let the quiet remain. And for Karoline Leavitt, that moment had finally come. 3 days after the exhibition, a small white envelope arrived at Karoline Leavitt's Georgetown apartment. No media vans outside. No flashing headlines this time. Just her name written in careful cursive with a return address in Brooklyn. Inside was a single sheet of linen paper, thick, unpretentious, and stained faintly with watercolor. It was from Felix Moreau. The curator who had once dismissed her as a PR clown now wrote in a trembling hand, "I was wrong. You weren't a gimmick. You were the only truth we had in a room full of presentation. You didn't wear a brand, you wore yourself. For that, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you gratitude. No signature flourish. Just Felix and a smudge, where he had likely reconsidered every word before sealing it." Karoline read it once and placed it in the top drawer of her nightstand. Not because she needed the validation, but because sometimes even netizen cynics, when humbled, deserve a quiet kind of mercy. Later that afternoon, another message arrived. This one, digital. From a name she hadn't heard or wanted to hear for over a decade, Eleonora Blake. The subject line was a single word, fire. Karoline hesitated before clicking. The email opened into several paragraphs carefully structured, as if Eleonora were grading herself now instead of her student. She recounted that critique all those years ago, the one that had sent Karoline out of the studio and into politics. She admitted she remembered it well. Too well. But it was the final line that held Karoline still. "I told you I didn't see fire in you. But I understand now it wasn't the kind that scorched. It was the kind that simmered. Slow, patient, enduring. I was too blinded by drama to recognize something real. And that quiet flame. That's the rarest kind of art." Karoline didn't respond. She didn't need to. Some things were better left in stillness. She spent the rest of the week sifting through interview requests, gallery invitations, and TV offers. Everyone suddenly wanted her to talk about the painting, the silence, the standing ovation. Some wanted to give it a title, a trend, even a movement. A major gallery in Soho had offered her a solo show. A publisher suggested a coffee table book. But Karoline turned them all down kindly but firmly. "I didn't paint to be seen," she told them. "I painted because I finally had something worth feeling again." That's enough. There was peace in that refusal. It was the kind of peace you didn't get from applause or headlines, but from knowing you had reclaimed something you once buried. Not to display it, not to monetize it, but simply to own it again. And then, almost quietly, life resumed. The cameras faded. The interviews stopped. The story slid off the trending charts. And Karoline went home. Back in their Georgetown apartment, Nicholas was in the kitchen gently boiling water for tea. The kettle whistled faintly as Nico darted around the living room, trailing a paper airplane and laughter behind him. It was a small space, but to Karoline, it was cathedral enough. On the far wall above the hallway, lamp hung a new frame. Not ornate, just simple wood, honey-colored. Inside was a reprint of the painting from the exhibition Still See After Storm. Scaled down, but untouched. The same solitary figure at the edge of the water, her silhouette leaning into the quiet. Karoline looked at it every night now. Not with pride, but with recognition. She no longer saw it as a performance or even a turning point. She saw it as a mirror of who she had been, of who she still was. And beneath the painting, stitched into the matting, was a single line, one she had written quietly with a pen. Nicholas had left on the counter. I didn't paint to be seen. I painted to remember I once dared to live true. And just like that, the girl who once painted in the dark stairwell at 17, the woman who walked away after being told she lacked fire, the mother who spoke for a nation but had forgotten her own voice, was now whole again, not loud, not blazing, just real, just enough. And somewhere beneath the soft hum of the kettle and the rustle of a child's footsteps, that quiet flame kept burning steadily, humbly, eternally. Sometimes the parts of ourselves we bury the deepest are the ones most worth bringing back. Karoline Leavitt's story reminds us that it's never too late to return to something that once made us feel alive. In a world that often celebrates noise, her quiet act of painting, done not for attention, but for healing, became a louder statement than any speech could deliver. Many of us, especially as we grow older, carry chapters we've closed too early. Dreams left behind. Talents silenced by doubt, or voices hushed by the fear of failure. But Karoline showed us that even a flame long forgotten can still burn gently, steadily, truthfully. You don't need an audience to make your life meaningful. Sometimes, doing something just for your soul is the most courageous act of all. So we ask you, is there something you've left behind that still quietly calls to you? Tell us in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else. And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that speak to the heart, not just the headlines. Because it's never too late to remember who you are